Thank you so much for being here with me today, Priya. Heading into it, would love if you could kind of describe your journey and how you ended up in broadcast and then in consulting.
I started out with like kind of a long-term dream from being, a kid on up of wanting to be a journalist and wanting to tell stories. I went off and I did that for local stations and national stations, and I found my way a couple times into some fun communications channels as well, working as strategy director, communications director, public affairs. Which has had me traveling to interesting places, including getting to hang off parts of the Golden Gate Bridge. It's been a wild ride, but there's a lot of joy to be had in moving between different kinds of storytelling, both journalism and public affairs.
Yeah, and I really like that you've kind of been all over the place. I think hanging off the Golden Gate is really cool. Not something many of us would get to do, so definitely a draw when it comes to looking at future careers. One that lets you do
And
that is pretty
you know,
sick.
I'm happy to also kind of talk through the steps along the way. So if you
Yes,
would like a deeper dive, I can take you through it.
would love that. Would love that.
So I promise not to spend too long in my childhood, but I did join my elementary school newspaper in fourth grade because I love to write and I love to talk to people. And I ended up moving middle schools, and the new school did not have a newspaper or any kind of outlet like that. And so I led a student revolution to have our voices heard and start a newspaper for seventh and eighth graders. And then as time went on, I started to see how we were depicted as journalists in the media. And it really bothered me that every time I would see reporters kind of ganging up on a victim, it seemed like, in those Law and Order type shows, people are coming down the courthouse steps and reporters are just yelling questions at them and seem to have no sympathy. And I just didn't see myself in that. That's not who I imagined myself being. And so I actually stepped away from it for a little bit. I thought I was going to go into documentary work. I wanted something that was what seemed to me to be kind of a gentler form of storytelling. And then as time went on, I realized that documentary work is great, but it is a much slower burn. And I like the immediacy of being able to tell stories more quickly and with sort of daily relevance and impact. And I realized also as time went on that not every reporter needed to be what I was seeing portrayed on TV. So I went to grad school for journalism. I did study both anthropology and communications in my undergrad days and did the campus TV station. And I look back on some of those tapes now. And it's sort of endearing. I mean, it's a little cringe to look back at your younger self and see when you're starting out, but it also reminds me that that's where the 10,000 hours, as they say, is needed for expertise. That's where my 10,000 hours started, is when I was a young kid and stumbling through my stand ups and having a hard time getting my words out or standing with some confidence and speaking with confidence. And it has definitely taken a long time to kind of move through that. From undergrad, I went and worked at a baby TV station in Santa Barbara as their program director and then as their news producer for a brand new newscast they had. So at 23, 24, I was hiring an entire news team,
Wow.
negotiating anchor salaries, building out a set. Really, really fun, exciting stuff. Always wanted to go to grad school, so I was lucky enough to be accepted at USC and went to the Annenberg grad program there in broadcast journalism. And then, one of the things people often ask me is it worth it to go to graduate school? And I will say it's a different day and age right now than it used to be. So my question, my answer might be a little less certain, but at the time, I will say for sure it was worth it, very much because of the network. It's great to go and practice and to learn the craft in the field. But if I hadn't been at USC, I very likely would not have been scouted by NBC News to go and work with them. So I went and joined their News Associates program, which was it was a diversity program, which I know is kind of a dirty word right now, and that's a hard thing to see. But NBC News at the time really recognized that they did not have enough people of color telling the stories that they wanted to tell each day, that they weren't reflective of what this country is. And so they gathered about 6 of us to come in as news associates and learn throughout the business. So I spent 3 months with Tom Brokaw, 3 months with Brian Williams, 3 months with Dateline NBC, and 3 months at their smallest owned and operated station, which was in Birmingham, Alabama, as a local daily reporter. Wow. So that was great. And then I went on from there to work for MSNBC and NBC Network News as a campaign embed. And I was traveling with Dick Gephardt on the Democratic side until he washed out of the presidential elections, and then with Dick Cheney in Air Force Two across the country for 6 months. And that was its own education.
That's really cool, and I think that's a great overview of your broadcast days, which I know we're going to talk a little bit more about your time on the campaign trail later, but sounds like it was really formative in pushing you forward into other areas of comms too, because that through line from being a documentarian to becoming a broadcast journalist, did you kind of come into both with the idea of having more of an investigative mindset, or what really propelled you to pursue journalism? Was it more of the investigative? Was it, you said the thrill was definitely part of it?
You know, for me, it really was about talking to people and sharing their stories. And I do believe in the power of knowledge to change communities, to inform them, to inspire people to action. And so that desire, really deep desire for knowledge and knowledge sharing is what continues to compel me to this day. Yeah. And certainly was part of my work, you know, all along. So it wasn't quite the end of my broadcast days yet. At that point, I went to a local station in San Francisco. I went to KTVU and I worked there for 3 days. 3 years, sorry. I worked there for 3 years. And KTVU, I had never worked at that point. I'd done pretty well in my career, but I'd never worked as a daily news reporter. And there is so much that teaches you to be live multiple times a day. I started as the morning reporter. Then after my contract was up at KTVU, I was free to continue there or look for other places. And I'd always had my eye on returning to New York. When I worked for NBC and for both as a campaign embed and as a news associate, I'd worked and lived on the East Coast in New York and DC. And I really wanted to get back to the big time. And so I was really fortunate that NBC talked with me about that, but I ended up going to CBS as a full-time correspondent, and within the year also started anchoring their Saturday morning news desk. So it was a really exciting, fulfilling time for me. It is hard to overstate what it's like to get to tell stories at that level. You have really, really smart people that you're working with as producers, as editors, your production crew, your camera operators, and your sound or lighting folks are also really engaged with the story from their mindset as well. It's not just about setting up a great looking shot, but it's really about what is the content of the story that we're telling. And trying to work super hard to make that matter. I was there for the Wall Street meltdown of 2008 and reporting live from the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. I went to Malawi, Africa, and covered Madonna's adoption of her second child from Malawi, which was a case that went to their Supreme Court. We were trekking through all kinds of villages and tracked down the guy who was the daughter of this kid that Madonna was adopting, who didn't even know he had a child at that point. So just really interesting stories, interesting times. And it was at a time where there was still more viewership of national news than there is right now. It wasn't quite as fractured a communications landscape as it is these days. But after I had done that for some time, I'd been ready for a while actually to focus on some other parts of my life. And a really great guy came back into my life and we decided to get married. And I said I was ready to leave New York and move back to San Francisco, which is where he was based and his business was based. So I moved back to the Bay Area, and at first I was still freelancing and working for CBS and for KTVU actually, but we had 2 kids back to back right away, and it was just this like joy in my life that I was so happy to get to experience this new chapter. And it became very clear very quickly how hard it is to be a mother and be working in news. You know, when something is happening in the world, the network calls and they say, you know, Arizona is on fire, go now. And you don't know when you're going to be back. You don't know what situations you're going into. And we didn't have full-time care, so I'd be flying my mom into town while I was flying out somewhere so she could take care of the kids. It just got to be too much. It just got to be too much. And I decided that I'd had a great run with broadcast TV, but that I was going to be done with it and focus on other challenges. So I did, and I moved on to starting a video production business in which I did biography filmmaking and lots of corporate video as well, fundraising videos for galas, just putting the same talents to use in a new sphere, and realized very quickly that that entrepreneurial journey is also a big commitment and a lot of work. It was like baby number 3 on top of the 2 that we already had. And after a few years of doing it, I'd grown it to be really a great going concern. It was active. We had 12 people working with me and a good client book. And I was just burnt out from it and wanted to spend time doing something that I thought was a little bit more stable and didn't have all of the highs and the lows of the entrepreneurial journey. Thankfully, my executive producer was interested in buying it for me, so I sold it to her. Felt very proud of myself for all I'd accomplished, and I went off and took a very stable government job, but still a fun one, at the Golden Gate Bridge. And I was their public affairs director for 5 years. It was an incredible experience. And then news came calling. I thought I was done with it, but you know, that siren song called and I was invited to come and audition to be an anchor for KQED, which is a local PBS affiliate here in San Francisco, and to host a California news and politics show. So I did that knowing that it was very likely on the chopping block. Thankfully, the management was very clear about that and open about that as I went into it. But still, I felt like it was a worthwhile experience and journey for me. So I took it and I was there for 3 years. And then at the end of the 3 years, they decided they weren't investing in TV anymore because the landscape is changing. The digital landscape is changing. So my show ended and I had already started another business on the side, doing storytelling and communication strategy. And so I leaned full time into that. We did a big series on emerging technology with several reporter friends. I worked for the California Academy of Sciences doing strategy and communications and research for them. Worked for an AI health tech company, worked for the city of San Francisco, welcoming 2,000 journalists into town when they had a big international conference called APEC. And then most recently, I've been working for a philanthropy and helping with climate change messaging last year or so. So I have definitely been on both sides of this equation and have had interesting experiences on both. They're very different. Your positioning and your perspective is very different, whether you are a journalist or in the public affairs side. One is, you know, asking the questions, and one is having to come up with the answers.
Absolutely. And I think that you leaving potentially, you know, public affairs position to go back into storytelling says a lot about, you know, the way you view your position as a storyteller. And I think kind of, we could talk about that later, but the responsibility storytellers have to continue telling those stories of those who can't tell their own. And so I think that's really cool.
Well, yeah, you know, I think there is storytelling on both sides of it. You know, when I'm at the Golden Gate Bridge, there are plenty of stories to tell about that beautiful landmark and icon. And there were a lot of really, excuse me.
Bless you.
There are a lot of really important stories about the time itself. So it's not just about the infrastructure, but at the Golden Gate Bridge, there were issues of safety for the roadway, issues of how much people need to pay in order to make sure that all the infrastructure is kept up. And we had social issues as well that we were dealing with, in particular, suicide, which was a big issue at the Golden Gate Bridge. And during my time there, the management was, we were all in finally at the point where we could install a suicide deterrent system and stop people from jumping off. And that was a big change for the bridge as well. So all kinds of stories, and stories of the people who work there that could be told externally, but also stories that need to be told internally to build alignment and understanding across the organization.
That's really great to hear. I mean, I think when a lot of people think of public affairs, they think primarily of, dealing directly with the government. So if you could go into a little bit more detail of what exactly you did when you worked in public affairs and kind of that through line, that where you got to really embrace that storytelling aspect.
So public affairs is, really a function of how does the world see your organization. It's, some of it is reputation, and some of it is, it's a little bit of marketing, but it's a lot of sort of truth telling about your organization, and about the great work that you might be doing. And so at the Golden Gate Bridge, it was very easy to do that because we had so many good stories to tell. There are other places that I have supported or worked over the years where it's not as easy to share stories, that there aren't as many ripe stories that are just, ready for serving. So let me talk about that experience at the Golden Gate Bridge, perhaps, as an avatar for like a good way to be able to do that. So we had stories that we would do about our staff, and we had, everyone from the sort of administration side who were running. It's not just a bridge, but there's also a bus and a ferry system that's associated with Golden Gate Bridge District. So we had administration that was running all of those. We had engineers who were working throughout the system. We had bus drivers, we had ferry operators, we had painters, we had iron workers. So we had all kinds of different people that we could tell stories about. And so those I crafted a series that was just called What We Do. And I would go around and just talk with different people in their roles. And then we would put those out mostly starting first at the board, and then we would share them publicly. And that was a great way to be able to bring the board into the different areas of our work without the board needing to go directly there and see it all in person. It was a good little snippet and a way to bring everyone together around a feeling of pride of the work that we did. And then when we would share those out publicly, people just gobbled them up. The opportunity to see the inside workings of how things actually got done at the Golden Gate Bridge was fun. We have something called the zipper truck, which goes along the Golden Gate Bridge and picks up the barrier that's in the middle and just moves it over to the side. So when it comes time for traffic in the morning or the afternoon, we can change which direction gets more traffic and handles the heavier flow so that it can keep moving. And we took people inside the zipper truck and showed them how that worked and talked with the operators as they were driving it. And that video, I don't know how many views it racked up. It was a lot of fun. People really enjoyed that one. And then there are times, for public affairs, you're also doing the crisis management.
Right.
So we had a couple of fun stories there. One was that one day I got a call from the engineers and they said, actually, no, I think it was from the Bridge Patrol. And they said, there's a car on the sidewalk of the Golden Gate Bridge. And it's just gotten out there and it's wedged tight. And the car had basically rolled through, kind of broken through a bollard that was out there and had gotten onto the side of the Golden Gate Bridge deck. And that was a moment where I sort of came up with this concept that I try to use now, which is having a golden sound bite. Have that one thing that you want reporters to pick up and to use. And so that day it was, I'm sure glad our engineers like a puzzle because this driver gave them one because they had to figure out how to extract it. And so it doesn't have to be super complicated. You want your golden soundbite to be something that is easy, catchy, simple to say, but also paints you in the light that you want to be in. And so that was kind of a fun story to work on. And then at one point, some daredevils had broken onto the bridge up the cables, and they'd climbed all the way up, and they'd done somersaults off the top, and they'd filmed themselves, not off the top meaning, down, but just along the top of the bridge.
Oh my.
And they'd film themselves and then they'd posted it online. And so that was an interesting, like, we had a little bit of a heads up that it was coming. We saw it online. It showed up in a news alert before it really went viral. But that video went viral and it was everywhere. I mean, everywhere. We were getting calls from around the world from news organizations who wanted to know about this. And so there are lots of things you're juggling at that point. You're juggling the communications, but you're also juggling the questions, the investigation of like, how did this happen? How did they get up there? What are we doing to make sure that it's not going to happen again?
Yeah.
In these moments where something breaks open and it's big and it's, often messy, my best advice is to try to get into it as fast as possible and plan on a 24-hour news cycle. If you know you can't avoid it, if you know you can't just, say we're gonna look into it. If you know you need to come out and actually do something. And in this case, we really did, because we needed to assure people that the safety and the security of the Golden Gate Bridge was not going to be compromised, that we did have plans for how we were going to make sure that that never happened again, why it happened this time, be able to explain that. But try as much as possible, and we were able to do it in this instance, to contain your situation to a 24-hour news cycle. Get your good messaging out there, get your good people out there, have them, share your message front and center, forthrightly, and then let it fade away. And so that is exactly what we did, and it worked well. And so we answered questions within that 24-hour news cycle, and then after that, we answered all the questions we needed to answer, but offline, off camera, so that we could sort of close down the spectacle of what was happening in that moment without ignoring it, without just saying no comment up front.
Absolutely. And so it sounds like there's kind of that through line of external, like public affairs. You have to be cognizant of the media relations part. You have to be cognizant of, public relations. So that's the marketing area of it. There's so much that goes into it. And so really, you're looking at like a synergy of storytelling, but also the practicalities of having to maintain a reputation.
Yeah, I think that's very true.
I think kind of like coming off of that and into more holistically looking at you and what has led you to kind of make these choices and what has led you to develop your sense of storytelling and develop your career as it has. I think kind of an overarching thing is, what does communication mean to you? Either in a personal, professional context, whatever, you feel.
I think communication is creating a shared understanding. It is finding a way, whether that is verbally or through an experience, or potentially some other means, to be able to share knowledge, understanding, perspective, feeling. That's what communication is. It's not about just, kind of saying some words and getting a message out. It is also about the reciprocal nature of a relationship, of kind of that back and forth of like, yes, here's the thing I'm saying. Do you also hear me? And sometimes that's possible. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes you're just standing up on a stage and saying, here's what I have to say, and hoping that somebody, listens and takes it into account. But whenever possible, the best forms of communications are around creating shared understandings.
I like that, creating a shared understanding. Which, as far back as communication goes to when we were, drawing cave paintings, really was just about conveying, this is what's happened, understand me. So that's really nice. And I think it's a very nice kind of guiding light when you're pursuing a career in comms. Okay, this is a little bit more of a solid question, a little less nebulous. Describe your communication style in 3 words, whatever comes to mind.
Well, I mean, if I was listening to myself on this podcast, I think I'd have to say long-winded. But in general, I would say direct, truthful, and concise.
Okay, I like that. And I think that's very much in touch with that journalism side of things, right?
That's right. That's right. I'd like to also say that I'm pithy or catchy, but to be honest, those are not the strongest skills I have. I am a pretty good presenter, but I'd say that I feel much more comfortable asking the questions than answering them. So, you have all the power in this relationship here.
I like that. No, it's definitely, I am not so as pithy as I'd like to be either. I feel like if you try to get me to say something off the cuff, oh
Yeah.
man, cannot.
Yeah. But it's also a good thing to be thinking about that, you don't have to have that. You don't have to have that gift of gab or storytelling in order to be a good practitioner of public affairs or public relations. That is not um, a career ending lack if you do not have that. My husband is a great public affairs practitioner, and he does have that ability to tell stories and land them with all kinds of diplomacy and aplomb at the same time. And I learn from him, but I find my strengths are more relational than in the conversation piece.
100%. I think maintaining that long-term relationship as you would when you're working in media relations is so different from, coming at it with more of a marketing or sales standpoint where you need to be, you need to be quick on your feet, need to be, able to respond in the moment in a way that incites someone to pick up your product. So definitely get that. It's something I'm working on. But
Good job.
thanks. Well, we'll get there. So another quick question I have is, what's your favorite content creation medium? As you mentioned, we're moving towards a new digital landscape, and so with that are TikTok, Blue Sky, Mastodon, so many different places to make your content, so many different places and mediums. What is your favorite?
I mean, I'm a video girl at the end of the day. That's my favorite. That's what I love to do. I love storytelling through video. And I'm probably, as I get older, going a little bit more back to my roots of liking longer form storytelling.
Okay.
But I'm like 100 million other users every day. I look at my phone, look at videos on my phone, and it's a lot of fun to see those. And I get a lot of information and humor and joy out of those as well. So
Yeah.
I think still for me, the moving picture, the moving image is still supreme.
100%. I totally get that. I think there's something, especially when, you're able to craft engaging video where it really speaks to that. There's something primal almost, which is why TikTok is so successful, right? When you get to see certain colors, certain, speeds of moving items, you just really are so much more engaged than you would be with just the written word. So I definitely get where you're coming from on that. I am a victim of the TikTok scroll for sure. Always on my algorithm.
When you were saying color as well, I'll tell you, I've been playing with an experiment this week of turning my phone's grayscale. Have you heard of this? That people are
I have heard of that.
Yeah, there's research that if you turn your phone to grayscale, you're going to use it less. So I thought I would do it this week and check my usage and see if it really did drop. And I've only done it for about 3 days, but I have to say I can already tell my usage is dropping. It's just not as engaging to pick it up without that color and that vibrancy. And it's also maybe a visual reminder to me that that's not where I want to be spending my time.
Yeah.
So I think it's been a fascinating experiment. I'm going to keep working on that and trying to
try
get
that.
outdoors instead of being behind my screen as much.
100%. I've got to try that. I think I no longer read anything on my phone. I have a e-reader, like a paperweight, because I just know if it's starts on the phone, it will not end with the reading. I'll just keep
That's
going.
right.
Yeah.
Then you think of something you want to look up and then a video, you're just going to check a message. Yeah. I
Yeah.
know.
No, it definitely never ends. So, we talked a lot about broadcast journalism and public affairs, and so I feel like a lot of the questions I have here about, understanding broadcast and public affairs and kind of their end goal, I think you did such a beautiful job already of touching on that, and I have an understanding of that now. So, when you think about public relations, there's a relationship building component, there's a change management component, and then there's understanding narratives and knowing which ones to uplift. At least that's kind of when I think of public relations, that's kind of where my brain goes. Now, with broadcast, I'm sure it's a little bit different. I'm sure that, there's a portion of that is effective visual storytelling. What would you say are the 3 kind of core tenets of a good story when you're trying to convey something effectively?
Okay. So tenets of a story, I would say, emotion is key. Emotion is key. I'm an information junkie, and so I want data and facts. I cannot go on just emotion alone. But the reason that we often take a story and find a primal central character is because we're working to evoke an emotion of some sort. We're working to connect to the audience through that character. And so for news storytelling, you'll see that very often news pieces revolve around some sort of core story with a beginning, a rising action, some sort of climax, and a little bit of falling action at the end. When I was in news at the network, we learned to put what was called the nut graph as the second one. So the very beginning would always be something to grab you, some sort of hook, some sort of emotion, some sort of interesting, sometimes an interesting fact, but usually something visual, or emotional. And then the next line would be the one where you really get the, like, here's what the story's about. So I guess of what I'm saying so far, I guess three things is where I'd end up is one, emotion is key. Two, facts, like facts matter. Let's put some of those in there. And then the third is visuals. Like, what are you showing? Show me something that's interesting. Show me something that's grabby. Give me those colors. Make sure
Absolutely.
Those are the things I'd say.
I like that. I think that it's so important to, and I had the inverted pyramid thing going on as well in school. I remember that lesson. And I think it really is so true to the way we consume stories. I think you're kind of looking for something to grab you, then you want the quick facts, and then you want to go into the nitty gritty of it. So 100%. And I think it's something that, even though I'm not currently working in journalism, it definitely governs the way I write things these days. I feel like I want to get people their information a certain way. So definitely get that. And that is something that is so central, is the way you present those facts.
And then I would love to turn to the public affairs side, because I thought it was interesting what you were saying, the three things, and I don't remember exactly what they were, but you're talking about, like, how do you align on the stories and how do you share those? But there's one piece that I would say that is so crucial when you're working inside an organization as a public affairs practitioner. And it's often overlooked, but it is, like, of core importance. And that is internal alignment. Right. So when you're a journalist, you're just out there. It's usually you, maybe, a small crew with you. Maybe there's a producer. And you back at the ranch, there's an editor who has an idea of what your story is going to be, but there's a lot of independence and autonomy in the work that you're doing. When you go into working in public affairs, you're working on getting a lot of alignment between a lot of stakeholders who all work at the same place in different functions, usually not comms, but in different functions, and have different ideas of how messaging should come out, what we should say, how much we should say, which way it should be portrayed. And I cannot overstate the importance of building internal relationships and alignment with your team so that when you go out with messaging, everyone is on the same page about what you're doing.
I think there's a lot of constructing of that messaging when it comes to a public affairs standpoint, because there are so many components to it, and I think that's a really, really interesting way to think about that. Definitely something to take with me. So we're gonna do a bit of a pivot here, which I know might feel a little jarring, but the next question commands it. How has journalism changed? And I think we're heading into such an interesting moment in time, whether it be the way people receive their news. I know Under the Desk on TikTok is huge. I feel like TikTok is actually a huge source of news for folks my age. And then also when it comes to, the increasingly polarized climate around news and around those who create and make that news. How do you think journalism has changed, and how do those things factor in?
Yeah, journalism definitely has changed. I mean, when I was younger and watching TV and watching journalists in the 80s and 90s, before I kind of was getting into the work myself, the news was what we turned on at 5 or 6, and we'd watch the evening newscast, and we had fewer sources of where our news was coming from with the big print publications as well. And journalists were more trusted than they are now. I mean, there's no question that it was maybe not quite the heyday. Maybe we were starting to come out of it. But it was journalists and news were much more critical and vital to people's everyday lives. And there was a lot of sort of respect for that work. That has all changed. It began sort of by fracturing into, for the broadcast world, cable news networks, which have proliferated and have also really espoused particular worldviews
Yes.
on the left and on the right in a way that the big broadcast networks always at least said that they weren't doing. Now, let's be honest. We're all humans. There's always a perspective that we bring with us, and we all have blind spots. We all have prejudices. And so the networks were no different in that they also did not portray always the full range of what stories were supposed to,
Yeah.
how they could be told. But there was at least a desire and a goal of objectivity, a goal of trying to tell things from multiple perspectives and
Definitely.
to not take sides. I mean, to the extent that it got a little ridiculous. I remember being at the networks at CBS, and some people wouldn't either they wouldn't wear an I voted sticker, or they wouldn't vote at all because they felt
Right.
like they're supposed to be objective and they're not supposed to take sides. I think that that's going a little far, but because I think we all are citizens as well and want to, be able to participate in our democracy. Um,
Yeah.
Anyway, all of that to say that there have been a lot of changes. Much of it, I think, maybe is exposing some truths that were already there, that there weren't enough perspectives that were being shared. And so people didn't find a place for themselves. So I don't know where we'll end up with how we do news, but there is this like multiplicity of perspectives that's a possibility now, since there aren't gatekeepers in the way that there were before. With all of that said, it's interesting. Like you know, I feel like when we first came, when like Netflix was getting big, and we had like a few streaming services that were really like exciting and amazing, and we'd all go to like these streaming services and see what they had to offer. It seemed like a new way of doing TV.
Right.
And now there are so many streaming channels. It almost just feels like the old cable channels, right? Like where you had
Yeah.
all these different options that you could look at.
Absolutely.
So, things like, I think everything morphs and evolves. And so we'll see. I'm curious to see how, even within the landscape of storytelling, of information sharing, breaking apart, like how does it coalesce and come back together? So there are a few streams that people feel like they can plug into, because then they become part of a community and they're not just hearing, a few voices of their own. But
Yeah.
I don't know, I'll say the one thing that kind of worries me, that bothers me for myself as for others, is that you don't hear perspectives outside of your own. So we all end up in these bubbles. It's very hard to break out of it. It's very hard to get news from a different perspective. There are a few places that are trying to make sure they show this, but that becomes very difficult when you just are constantly reinforced with your own message. For us to find common ways to speak across the nation. I mean, I'm not saying anything new here, but I will say what I think would be so awesome. If anybody happens to be listening to this and wants to come up with it, please, I will be your first beta user. I want a feed, like a filter that I can use on an Instagram feed or, TikTok feed, that I can like put in, show me what I would be getting if I was like an 18-year-old guy in Tennessee, or show me what I'd be getting if
Ah.
I was a 70-year-old Japanese woman in Seattle. Like, I want to know, what are the messages that other people are getting that I completely am unaware of.
Yeah.
That would be
I
very
mean,
cool.
I know the New York Times does stories where they have to do that, but then they've got to train like AI to reinforce that into an algorithm. And honestly, it would be so much easier if we could just see that.
Yeah.
And I think that again, it plays into what is such a huge topic right now in journalism, which is objective truth, and what does that even look like anymore? Like, I know that my school had certain policies sometimes around posting things on your social media,
Mhm.
or maintaining in that. And I think that's so interesting, because at some point, like, you are your own civically involved person outside of
Mhm.
and I think with this era we're heading into, those lines are more apparent than ever. So yeah, I think there's a
Mhm.
lot of changes happening, and I think that the climate 4 years ago when I started college is not the climate now after I've
Mhm.
graduated. So
Mhm.
definitely
Mhm.
interesting stuff.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, skipping ahead a bit, have you ever, is it difficult to handle tough topics when you're reporting when the audience is, a public or culture that you know intimately? Um, when you're kind of, even if it's just the American people, there are tough times that occur and you've got to report on them. The news needs to come out regardless. Is it ever tough sometimes to get in on a certain story and really talk about it?
Is it tough? I mean, I don't know that it has felt tough to talk about a particular topic. I'm trying to think of like what's a kind of a taboo topic that I have covered in the past. And I don't know. There's nothing that comes to mind immediately that I'm like, this is hard to talk about because the audience is going to have a hard time hearing it quite in that way. But I will say there are definitely times where I felt like it was hard because I didn't want to have to do the work of that the journalist has to do at that point. I mean, um, I covered a lot of homicide in Oakland in early morning hours, and there were a lot of times that I was knocking on someone's door and having to talk to them about a family member who had just passed away in, a shootout, and or at least offer them the opportunity to talk is really what I would give them. There was never, for me, I never felt like it was. I didn't want to be that person who was yelling at a family member or
Yeah.
begging them to talk to me when they didn't want to. But emotionally, that is very hard to carry. There were a few stories about kidnapped kids and working with those families and hearing their pain. There's pain all around with storytelling as a journalist often, and you're right there intimately in the thick of it. So there's a fire, a massive fire, there's a flood, enormous flood, there's a lot of loss and hurt and heartache that we often cover for
Yeah.
people. And I've heard it, I didn't know this term then. I wish I did, but I've heard it since, and I think it's very true that a lot of first responders also go through this, but journalists do too, and it's called vicarious trauma. And so the idea that because we're holding these stories and we're emotionally connected to the people that we are meeting and talking with, that we then also carry and are impacted by the trauma of the things that we see around us that we're reporting on. And that is hard to not do as
Yeah.
a human. We all are at different places on the empathy scale, but for anyone who's a reporter, it's often because you care about humanity and you want to be involved in it. Certainly for broadcast reporters, we often like people. We like going and talking with people and then sharing
Yeah.
those stories and connecting with our audience. And so we are people and we feel it pretty deeply. So that tends to be a weight that you carry and you find ways to let go of as well along the way so that you can do your work. When I lived in San Francisco and was working for a station in Oakland when I was younger, KTVU, I remember I would drive back home across the Bay Bridge and I would imagine myself taking the weight from my stories of that day and kind of throwing them out of the window and letting them go into the bay because I just didn't want to carry them with me
Yeah.
constantly and let that weight build up. So you have to find ways to sort of protect your own mind and your own heart and soul so that you can go out and do the work. Um, yeah, so I would say that's the place where it felt hard, rather than like feeling like a particular topic was hard to
Yeah.
talk about.
And I think that's a really important conversation to have too. If you're thinking about going into journalism, what's a piece of advice that you would give a young person or someone who's looking to break into journalism that maybe doesn't know all about the different sides of the industry?
Hmm. Well, now I would say just start. Where are you? Where do you live? What's in your community? Give it a try. Go get your phone out and shoot some stories, talk to some people, and start posting and learn as you go. The great thing right now is that you've got an incredible feedback machine, right there in your phone, in your pocket, that you can just start trying it, start making content, start sharing. If you want to go into work for an organization, any of that work that you do, that you've learned how to do along the way, is useful and helpful as well, because then they can see the kinds of things that you would do, and you'll have had some experience too. So I don't know, my piece of advice would be immediately to just try it, just jump in and give it a shot. I mean, you're going to learn as you do it, right? Your first story is very unlikely to be a really hard news, horrifying sort of scene in front of you experience. Start small, start with something you just know that you enjoy, that you're naturally attracted to, and start telling those stories. Start figuring out what your storytelling style is and what's important to you.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really cool way of looking at it. And I think that everyone's a journalist now, which is, definitely a conversation I had with the professor once. We can all do it. We can all post. We can all, if there's something happening around you, you can just pick it up and film it. I have a friend who, her roommate, they were in DC and there was some sort of natural disaster or something happening. And she tweeted about it, and it was embedded in an article by, I think, CBS. So really cool how these things work. You can do it yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great piece of advice. All right, so this is... What event, activity, or habit in your personal life has made you a better professional communicator?
Interesting. Event, activity, or reading in a heartbeat. That's the one thing that always makes you a better communicator. You learn new words, you learn how to say things, you learn where there are moments for drama and moments for pauses. You just learn so much through reading. Read fiction, read nonfiction. Obviously, you can get a ton of perspective and context for your storytelling, especially when you're reading nonfiction around the work you're doing. Fiction can do it too, and can give you an insight and into empathy, color, ways to use your words. Reading is absolutely 100% at the top of my list.
I like that. I definitely think that's kind of what I loved reading growing up, and I think that's kind of what drew me to it in a way as well. So yeah definitely.
I'm just getting back into reading nonfiction now. I read, probably like you, nonstop when I was a kid, and through most of my life. And then when I had my kids, I realized I couldn't read nonfiction anymore, because when I read nonfiction, I tend to get really into it, and I basically just do that. I'll go to work, I'll do my jobs, but I do very little else. So when I had these kids, I'm like, oh, they always need me. It's not just I'm going to take an hour and go to the gym, or I'm going to they just always need me. And so I gave up fiction for many years and just read nonfiction, because I liked it, but I felt like it was easier for me to put down and to pick up again later.
Yeah.
And now the kids are finally, they're middle schoolers, so I'm able to get back into reading.
Recently, there's been a lot of crazy going-ons when it comes to the freedom of the press, and kind of the way that journalistic integrity and kind of that agenda-setting function is being dictated, right? We're seeing kind of the decrease in power of the White House press corps, and the White House press secretary stating that the White House is going to control their press pool from here on out. That's just kind of a quick overview of what's going on. I know that there is quite a few things that go into, deciding those press pools and ensuring that there's fair coverage across the board. Just off the bat, are there any, major ramifications of this that you think we're going to see within the next couple of years?
I would say that journalists have a heart for truth telling. And, you've seen it over many decades that journalists find ways to continue to cover stories, continue to cover the news, even when they're left out of rooms. And so I think journalists are going to have to get a lot more savvy about looking for, no, let me say that differently. I think journalists are going to have to rely on those skills they have and rely on the instincts that they have to really work their sources when they don't get to be in certain rooms. Many years ago, I covered Dick Cheney when he was vice president, and he was traveling on Air Force Two, and I was part of the press pool. But the New York Times had been kicked out of that press pool, and the reporter there had to then take his own flights, meet up with us at rallies. There were certain briefings he wasn't part of, but he still did incredible coverage, excellent coverage of what was happening in the Cheney campaign. And in some ways, maybe it was even better because he was not so close and inside the bubble. I'm not saying that that's right for the press pool.
Right.
I think our democracy relies on free, fair, open communication with the press. And that reporting is critical to how we function in a society. So I'm deeply disturbed and concerned and disappointed by what I'm seeing right now. And at the same time, I would say, don't count journalists out.
Absolutely. I really like that kind of like end mark. I think a lot of people forget that so much of journalism is being savvy beyond the means you're given. I remember hearing about, the amazing work done by citizen journalists in Wuhan, where there isn't so much of that freedom of speech. What are some of the things that we can keep in mind as consumers of this news when we're looking at the news to make sure it's coming from that fair and unbiased standpoint and that we're getting the best news we can?
Yeah, the only thing you can do is try to consume a multiplicity of sources. You really cannot you're going to have to read many things from many places and see what you think and what you believe. So use your intellect, use your critical thinking skills, and try to read across a spectrum or listen or watch across a spectrum of news choices. Go seek out the ones that are not being fed to you because they're never going to come directly to you, but go look for channels and sources that seem to have opinions that are antithetical to what you believe is true, to at least hear what they're saying and see what of their argument does seem to make sense, and allow yourself to be curious and question in those moments, and also recognize the places in which you find there are untruths or lies. So it's unfortunately, it is certainly left up to the individual. And we are also at a time in which news is easy to manipulate. Information is easy to manipulate. And I think I have serious concerns about authenticity of news or information that's coming across. There's so much misinformation and disinformation that's being planted. And, I'm super fascinated by emerging technologies, love learning about all things AI. And I also see, as so many do, the inherent dangers that are lurking there.
Yeah, 100%. I think especially when it comes to ChatGPT and it's a lot of its initial days, just putting out untruths when it comes to certain things. You always have to double check that. I think you mentioned that you have some concerns about that. What are some of those big glaring concerns that jump out at you when you're thinking about, the future of reporting and AI?
Well, I'll tell you right now, one of the things I'm doing is crafting biography films for people. And that's a side project, passion project that I have. And I've started to look into how I can ensure that there's some sort of authentication process for people. So if I'm putting together a story of a older family member and they're recounting their experiences and their memories and we're sharing pictures, is there a way in which I can stamp it with a seal of authenticity so that when their great 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 grandkids take a look at it and want to understand what happened in their family history, that they can have some security in knowing that it was authentically that family member. Because now with 3 seconds of sound, AI can replicate someone's voice. AI can replicate someone's image. And so the potential for us to lose um, all attachment to truth and to authenticity is there. It's here. It's here now. And I don't know where that ends, but the fact that it can be done right now is incredibly scary when we talk about living in a post-truth world.
Yes.
So yeah, that concerns me.
Yeah,
That concerns me a
I
little.
get
It
that.
doesn't keep me up at night because I sleep very well. Because there's not, I can only do little bits about that.
I love that.
But that is absolutely on my mind.
Yeah, no, and I agree with you. I think that those safeguards are not as strong as they should be. I mean, I was watching a video with my mom yesterday. There was like a crazy looking animal, and we were watching it. And we were like, my sister was like, "Yo, what is that?" It took us a solid 2 minutes of watching that loop before I looked at it and I saw a slight shimmer, and I was like, "Oh my god, it's AI."
That's right.
We literally were like, "Is there a new discovery? Like, what
That's
is this
right.
thing?" Yeah. And then my mom looked at it and she was like, "Oh my god, I really thought that was real."
Yeah,
It's so convincing. What are we supposed to do?
that's right. And we're at the dawn of AI.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
What's going to happen when it's a toddler?
I
Terrible
love that.
days are coming.
Yeah, when it's a toddler. Oh my.
Yeah.
Yeah. Definitely
Yeah.
still in its infancy. So, a lot coming that way.
Yeah, I don't know if you heard this, but OpenAI apparently is about to release different kinds of agents, and so you can get like a high-end knowledge worker, high-skilled knowledge worker for like $2,000 a month, and it
Yes.
goes all the way up to like a PhD researcher for $20,000 a month. And so yeah, the work is being done by AI, so it raises enormous questions for the future of work, the future of human productivity, and as well as how do you distinguish between artificial and biological?
100%
Sure.
agentic AI is terrifying. I think especially with Klarna laying off like so much of its workforce in order
Mhm.
to automate. I mean, their CEO came out and said, "I could be fired and taken over by AI." And that's
Yeah,
terrifying.
yeah, and so
That
true, so
the
real.
only real separators between work that can be automated and can't be automated is who has the money. So,
Yeah,
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 leaves a lot of open gaps
yeah.
and open spaces, but hopefully this turns out to, we turn out those safeguards sooner rather than later.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think later is here and gone. I think later
Oh,
was yesterday. And I don't know what happens now in terms of safeguards. I mean, I feel like that door of privacy or legitimacy for materials is very wide open, and that horse has definitely left the stall.
yeah.
So, I don't know where it ends up. Let me say that I every day find inspiration in other people and in nature and in the world that we have. And so, yes, while tomorrow may be very different than we know it, I do have hope and faith, really, that we are going to find our way through it and that we will reach out to each other, and build community and build structures that allow us to have really well informed, abundant, rich lives. And I'm looking forward to what comes. While it could be that you could live in the fear, I think we also have to live in the hope and positivity of the future and what these changes are. So
Yeah,
let's see what's to come. Let's keep an open mind and see what's to come.
absolutely. And I think that's such a nice note to end things on and such a nice way to put things. There's always going to be change and there's always going to be progress. So,
Yeah.
hoping we see more of the latter.